Let me offer this poem by Tom Devine, our Tom Devine, who first wrote it about 30 years ago. Like Tom, it went through many changes. It found its final form about 11 years ago. It's called Story, and it foreshadows much that I have to say today. Suppose you found the courage to tell your story and nobody listened. They told you to sit down, or they kept on talking, or they left the room. Would you continue telling it to the air? Maybe the air listens. Maybe the crows take threads from your stories back to their nest and cushion the place where new life rests in its shell, waiting for warmth. Suppose you told your story and someone listened and listened till you had no more to tell, and then told you their story. Just suppose. The night I found my listener, my story looked less like my reflection in the mirror and more like someone I had met by chance, who came to stay one day and wouldn't leave. It went away that night, but still it comes to visit me at times. A late night knock, a crooked smile, and rambling on past bedtime. But now I listen, and I tell it often, knowing that if I hear and tell it right, it will become just one of many tales. For when it's not my story, the morning light looks different as I wake, not knowing what's supposed to happen next.
It's with great pleasure that I introduce the speaker today, who actually needs no introduction to most of you, Bill Heavlin. In case you didn't know, Bill retired recently after working for 54 years. His career began at age 13 and concluded last year in Silicon Valley. He has one son, well established in Minneapolis, one dog, also embellishing her retirement, and one wife, Noreen, actively embellishing his retirement. With Noreen, Bill is one of the principal lay leaders of the Unitarian Universalist Coastside community. So he might look a little bit familiar. Today's sermon, Hymn for the Lonely in Spirit, consists of 4 parts or verses. They progress through the emotions of loneliness, its causes, some solutions, and some community implications. So without further ado, Bill.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for the beautiful poem, by the way. As some of you are aware, my wife Noreen just returned after a 10-day trip to Florida visiting family. So for most of the time I was working on this sermon about loneliness, I was alone, with my dog, but otherwise alone, researching loneliness, the feelings of loneliness, its causes, consequences, ways to be less lonely, community implications, and feeling pretty achy, a little bit empty inside, busy but quite alone. I've come to believe that loneliness represents the central spiritual issue of our time. Alas, I feel we could fill the next 12 months exploring different aspects of loneliness, always remaining relevant, always offering something fresh. This year, the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, issued a report declaring loneliness as an epidemic in the U.S., all a little too close to home. Verse 1. The following prose poem is assembled from a few sources. A 2018 article by Maggie Ferguson in The Economist was especially useful. I call it Last Taboo, an assembled poem. Loneliness freezes you, so much that you can hardly get out of bed. You wake and think, what the hell shall I do? I make lists, try to tell myself that today is a new day, because I have no one to do nothing with. Loneliness feels like failed solitude. Terrible feelings of failure, shame, worthlessness, of not fitting in, of feeling rejected. Loneliness feels like bereavement, like the enormous loss of something. Even though it's an absence, it's suffocating, tight and strangling and suffocating. And now your best friends are all on TV. Of course, none of them know your name. Mental health problems and depression are quite fashionable nowadays. Loneliness is not fashionable. You say, I'm lonely, and they say, swipe left. Loneliness is the 21st century's leprosy, a disease eating its victims while repelling those they encounter. It's the last taboo. Because you're in a dark cloud. Since you don't want anyone to see you, you get lonelier. A vicious cycle, surrounded by a dark void that has no exit. It's a hurt that penetrates but does not dissipate. As if some stranger now inhabits your skin, you're outfitted with a false set of limbs and neck. As if, being offered a full meal, you cannot taste any of it. It happens quite regularly. Bodies lying undiscovered until neighbors complain of the smell. Because they had no one to do nothing with. Verse 2. For the following, I'm particularly indebted to psychologist Nick Wignall. It's a little hard to define loneliness, in part because everybody knows what it is. But loneliness is an emotion, a feeling, not, say, a circumstance. Two people can be equally solitary, but only one perceives solitude as painful. Fundamentally, it's about not feeling connected to other people. Possible causes of loneliness, which happen on different timescales. There's negative self-talk. It's possible to fall into that habit, and it breeds loneliness. Or someone could be abused as a child, so hasn't learned to communicate well. And a partner of someone not communicative, this too can result in loneliness. Common causes of loneliness. There's social anxiety, which is some combination of feeling being judged ill by others and being too anxious by being in the presence of others. Lack of assertiveness can cause loneliness. I surely relate to this one. This is just the ability to express your wants in a way that's honest to yourself and respectful to others. And, relatedly, when you think poorly of yourself, you might not think you're worthy of attention, worth of expressing your wants, your needs. And maybe you don't even know what it is you want. Some lonely people are not really connected to their own emotions, beliefs, desires, and so on. And Some lonely people don't even know what they really care about, what they value. This is called values confusion. Values are the things that matter most to us. And if you don't know what your values are, you might find yourself among the people with different values and therefore find yourself feeling alienated, odd man out. So there's this relationship with yourself. Some people hide from themselves by keeping super busy. And, or you can try to fix heavy emotions like anger, fear, grief, rather than sitting with them. Or you can intellectualize your feelings away, like this is what happens to all retired people. Or the Buddha wouldn't ache, so I shouldn't ache. Or sigh. Time cures all. Anyway, not having a good relationship with yourself, feeling you need to maintain a Hallmark card persona, feeling like a stranger in your own skin, that's pretty lonely making. Verse 3. In the mid 80s, I was working at a software startup in its evaporation phase, its dissipation phase. Found myself in a big server room, backing up to magnetic tape, programming on the co-located mini computers, alone in a big, wide, whirring room. Occasionally a person would enter. I found myself talking a lot. Not exactly with a coherent story to tell, but with the compulsion to talk on. Like a mountain man coming down to deliver a season's pallet of fur pelts, with that compulsion to talk on. This phrase has entered my family's lexicon. Mountain man syndrome. Lonely and wanting to talk on and on to reconnect with another human. And somewhere in all this experience of being lonely, this discovery of your own loneliness, somewhere from it all comes the seed for a secret superpower. Because if you're lonely, if you ever used to be lonely, then you know loneliness. So how hard can it be to recognize loneliness in another person? It's about as hard as recognizing the inherent worth and dignity in every human being. That's maybe hard, but doable. As Naomi Shihab Nye, poet, might say, when you encounter the sorrow of loneliness as the deepest thing inside, you might discover also kindness as the other deepest thing. She continues, then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. For many, people are only lonely because they crave to be listened to, crave to tell their story, to have their story be heard, and themselves thereby seen, as in today's poem, Story observes. So here's some advice for connecting with lonely people. Being a kind presence might be just enough. You don't have to talk to people with the goal of solving any problems. You just show up and you listen, show up with the kindness of listening. It helps greatly, profoundly, if you're consistent. Weekly check-ins rather than monthly hour-long conversations. And be explicit about your feelings toward them. Remind them how your relationship is important and creates a role model for them to reciprocate. Don't be pushy, but do persist. And they'll probably need a warm-up period, and you'll want them to let them get comfortable. Hey, churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, volunteer organizations can all be good for this. Places where you can slip in to be around people, slide into becoming more comfortable with people, with former strangers. Places where kindness turns toward you, says, "It is I you have been looking for," and then follows you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. One of the big ideas in clinical psychology is how behavior can reshape our feelings. For instance, giving to charity. You might think, and some of the info on the UUA website suggests this, that with enough gratitude, then you start donating money, time, and so on. So the ideas in our head, the feelings in our heart, gratitude, from such an overabundance, it pours out and over so that, of course, we give. We become generous. By analogy, in our head, in our heart, we feel spiritual. Then from a surplus of positive emotion, joyful spirituality, we start going to church. But of course, it doesn't work that way. But what does work? Doing something like donating your time or going to church, and then our feelings backfill so that the behavior now makes sense of those deeds. By doing X, we come to feel good about X. We act kindly, and some mirror reflects back our feelings to us, presents to us our most recent kindly deeds. So by reaching out to the lonely, or anybody really, we become less lonely. By attending church, even when you're not quite feeling up to it, we become less lonely. By encountering kindness, we become inspired to kindness and less lonely. Behavioral activation prescribes this in small steps. 1, list the things you most enjoyed doing. 2, rank them by the degree to which it would be easy to do again, their doableness. 3, score them by how much you enjoyed them. 4, take your top doable and break it down into small steps. 5, track progress, track enjoyment, rinse and repeat. And there's a version of this around values, because when you're not clear about what your values are, it's hard to find other people who share them. Similar process. List your happiest 3 days. Look for patterns among these days. From these patterns, try to articulate values. Pick one personal value and identify activities that align with these values and try some of these out. rinse, and repeat. Verse 4. A 2023 report just this year by the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy is entitled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Social Isolation. This report's point of view is sociological, defining loneliness as the lack of social connection. Social connection is defined as the opposite of loneliness, its antonym. 1 in 2 adults have reported experiencing loneliness. With the health consequences of chronic loneliness comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And empirically, being socially connected is one of the strongest protective factors against self-harm and suicide. The Surgeon General also speaks of social capital, the number of people on which you can call for help if you need to. It's not exactly the number of favors you can call in. It's the number of relationships. So I invite you all to reflect on that. Who makes up your social capital? And for whom do you count as social capital? And do they know it? It can be a very powerful experience to learn, to realize that someone is there for you. And social capital is the lifeblood of any UU congregation. Please make a note of this. Particular people, true, and also people you know through this institution. Churches are examples of socially connected communities. Many book clubs are like this, or become like this. Some writing groups are like this, or evolve into this, bound together by meaningful conversations. Maybe you can think of socially connected communities as your people, all a source of social capital. They build up social capital. The Surgeon General's report also speaks of fostering a different kind of community connection, the bridging between social communities, all as an approach to addressing loneliness. This idea truly turns my head and invites us to contemplate approaches to bridging the Latino and Anglo communities, say, and various pockets of communities within each, seniors, farm workers, and so on. We can do much to foster community bridging simply by valuing in our planning community bridging itself. In this COSIDE short on low-cost housing, intermixing the housing of farm workers, government workers, teachers, seniors, this can engineer community bridges by diversifying its neighbors, neighbors bridging to others beyond their own community. By thickening the social connections, we increase that most protective factor against self-harm and suicide, social connection. So before us lie opportunities. Behavioral activation you can use to work out your interests, your values, lonely or otherwise. Perhaps your values suggest places for you to volunteer. And speaking of volunteering, when you advocate for social justice, be vigilant for solutions that bridge among communities. It's up to you whether to tell people you heard about this in a church. And I invite all of us to contemplate, to calculate our social capital, and especially to enumerate those for whom we represent the social capital of others. A community like UUCC is a good place for building out social capital and mitigating loneliness. We're going to pause now for some music. For when it's not my story, the morning light looks different as I wake, not knowing what's supposed to happen next. Let us now turn to create hope.